Hey everybody, this is Jim. I hope you're having a good week. Good job on the welcome videos. This presentation begins the Trade Approach, Unit 2. What I plan to do is briefly review the leadership process model, which is the basis of the class. Explain a little bit about the Trade Approach, how it works, some of the strengths and criticisms, and how it fits into the leadership process model. And then I'll finish by showing you how you fill out the theory matrix for the trade approach, and that will provide an example that I think will help you fill your theory matrix each week. So let's jump into the leadership process model. The leadership process model is put together by Dunham and Pierce, and it was their explanation for how leadership works. And they define it as a dynamic, interactive process between a leader who is guiding people or a situation, the followers who are performing or acting, working, the context, and the context can be formal or informal. It could be a workplace such as a restaurant or a feedlot. It can be a nonprofit organization such as the Friendship Home. It can be a sports context like a basketball court, tennis court, football field. And then 4 is the ways that influence happens. And so, for example, in ALEC 102, one of the things we looked at is interpersonal skills, and that's part of the way influence happens. And some of you identified some key interpersonal skills that were a part of your leadership philosophy. And then there's the outcomes and the results. So what Dunham and Pierce argue is that leadership is a dynamic process that always has these elements to it: leader, follower, context, circumstances, then ways that influence is happening, followed by outcomes. And what we're going to do in this class is take different theories and approaches that explain different parts of this and show why different parts are important at different times, so that each of these theories will give us some insight into the way the leadership process is working. And for this first unit, we're going to look at the trait approach. So let's do that now. Coming back here to the trait approach. Trait approach is one of the first systematic attempts, there we go, to study leadership. And it began with what was called the great man theories, which were identifying innate specific qualities and characteristics that were true of leaders rather than followers. And they were qualities possessed by great social, political, military leaders like Napoleon or Gandhi or Abraham Lincoln. And that's how leadership was identified, those great leaders. Over time, in the 20th century, research began to see that there were a variety of traits that leaders could possess, and some of those traits made leaders effective in different contexts. And so a leader might be effective in one context, like sports or teaching, because of traits that they have, but then they might not be effective in another context that would require different traits. So these individuals began to research and identify various kinds of traits that were effective. Nordhaus discusses 5 traits: intelligence, self-confidence, determination, integrity, and sociability. And these were often perceived from research to be true of leaders, the kinds of personality traits that they had. Another area that was researched a lot was the Big 5 personality. And what this did was it took a lot of various characteristics and it grouped them together in 5 groups. Neuroticism, extroversion, openness, agreeableness, conscientiousness. And then it studied various contexts and followers and leaders to see when traits were most effective or what traits were most true of leaders. One thing that this research has showed is in many instances, followers tend to identify the leader as the one who has extroversion. The leader is sociable, assertive, or has positive energy. Other research shows that the most effective leaders are those with conscientiousness, a tendency to be thorough, organized, controlled, dependable, decisive. These personality characteristics were traits that were true of various kinds of leaders and individuals, and that allowed them to be effective in different contexts. So that is the trait approach, and the way it works is it focuses exclusively on the leader and the traits the leaders exhibit and who has those traits. And effective leadership is having certain traits that allows you to be effective in certain contexts. And it's not really about the follower or the context or even always what the leader is doing, but what makes that leader effective is, by necessity, they have certain personality traits. This is used as companies hire people. They look for certain people with certain traits. A lot of times you'll see this approach used in personal awareness and development. You'll take a personality test that identifies certain personality characteristics you have, certain traits you have, and then you could kind of say, okay, if I have those traits, I might be able to be effective in these kinds of situations or with being this kind of a leader. There are some strengths to the trait approach, and Nordhaus goes through some of those, and I'll let you read that, but I do think it's important to remember there's a lot of research, a century of research that has gone in to show there is some credibility that leaders have certain kinds of traits, or certain kinds of traits are effective in different situations. This is kind of intuitive in the sense that there's a perception, we realize that leaders oftentimes have different characteristics than followers. So those are some strengths of this approach. Some weaknesses are we have failed to identify a definitive list of traits. This could be subjective, highly subjective, as to what traits work or are, what kinds of leaders are effective in different situations based upon their traits. And do leaders need these traits? Certain coaches need traits, or teachers need traits. So that gets highly subjective. It also doesn't take into account the situational effects, meaning as you examine a context or a situation, sometimes that influences what a leader needs to do, and it's not just about the trait. Sometimes it's about the followers. And then trait approach isn't as effective for training and development because it's about personality characteristics. And training leaders focuses more on skills. So you can see there's some pros and cons to the trait approach. It has some validity, but it may not be sufficient to accurately describe the whole leadership process. So when we take the trait approach and plug it back into our leadership model, the trait approach is going to argue that the leader is central to this process. It's all about the leader and certain characteristics and traits that they have, and that's what makes leadership work. And some leaders can be effective with these kinds of followers or in this context, but they've got to have different traits. There's some accuracy to that, but it doesn't adequately describe the whole process. But it is one approach. Now, to move to your theory matrix, what you're going to be doing is taking this dynamic process of 5 elements according to the model: leader, follower, context, process, and outcomes. And for each of these approaches, you're going to be filling this chart in with, okay, what are some of the implications of the trait approach for the leader, and for the follower, and for the context, and how the context gets evaluated, for the process and what's going on with the process. Now, in the trait approach, you're going to have more information on the leader because it's highly about the leader, and mostly about the leader. So as you come to this square, you're going to put in the implications for some of the leader. Our leaders need certain personality characteristics, and you may identify some of the ones that are needed. And Norhaus explains some of those, and you could talk about the strengths and the advantages of that. I'll make some notes here. For the follower, there's not as much because the trait approach doesn't really impact the follower. It's about the leader. The context in the trait approach, the leader doesn't adjust to the context. Different contexts actually need different leaders because they need different leaders with different personality traits. The process is a bit one way. The leader with those traits works, or the leader has different traits and therefore the process doesn't work, but it's about the personality of the leader and his or her characteristics. And then, of course, the outcome. And the outcome is entirely dependent on what traits the leader has and how they use those. So that's how you would fill in this matrix for the trait approach, and you'll do that for each approach. So to wrap up, what we've done today is highlight the leadership process model, which we'll go over every unit again and again. This dynamic process of leader, follower, context, process of influence, and the outcomes. Those 5 things. Then we've talked about the trait approach, and you can read more about that and take your quiz. There is also a discussion to be had about the trait approach where you can weigh in. And then you'll do some reflection where you could talk about different aspects of the trait approach, things you read, and give specific examples in your leadership or in certain situations you may have been a follower where you saw that trait approach effectively identify the leader or not effectively work in the leadership process. So you can reflect on that in your journal. So, okay, again, as always, if you have questions, please text or email me, or text and email Heather. Otherwise, have a good weekend, and we'll talk to you at the next unit.